I appreciate that many of my colleagues have been in the fight to eliminate this fail-first therapies and improve prior authorizations for doctors, their staffs, and most importantly, for patients during the entire time I've been in Congress. Preserving the doctor-patient relationship has been the driving force behind many of my healthcare priorities since I've been here, and unfortunately, it's getting more and more difficult to make sure that the right drug gets to the right patient at the right time. And this often causes great harm to the patients. Prior authorizations often delay appropriate care, and step therapy might as well be called fail-first medicine. As a physician, neither are acceptable to me, and it shouldn't be acceptable to you either. Rare disease patients can face significant challenges when it comes to obtaining access to appropriate treatments due to insurance policies, medical necessity requirements, et cetera. In many cases, in fact, probably in most cases, the medications that are most effective for treating and managing rare conditions are used off-label. These treatments are often dramatically effective and very logical, but they are off-label. Years ago, cancer patients also got stuck by this problem, and a lot of cancer treatments were labeled first line or second line, et cetera. So, for example, if a doctor had a good reason to use drugs in a different order and different combinations, the treatment protocol might have been considered off-label and disapproved by insurers. And I can't tell you how often I face that dilemma in my clinical practice. Congress recognized this roadblock and it addressed it by directing payers to look beyond the label to compendia and peer-reviewed journal articles, et cetera, to meet the threshold question of medical necessity and appropriateness. Building off that successful effort, it's now time to allow for similar flexibility in the rare disease space. H.R. 6094, the Protect Rare Act, would amend medical necessity standards for rare disease patients so that peer-reviewed medical literature and published clinical guidelines, in addition to the simple FDA safety approvals, would satisfy the medical necessity requirements in statute. I appreciate my colleague, Ms. Matsui, for working with me on this important legislation. So why is it necessary in the rare disease space? Why should a treatment be used outside of the indication that it was originally approved for? Well, new therapies are frequently coming to market for rare diseases in small trials with small numbers of patients with heterogeneous symptoms mean very narrow labels. And that's not because the drug doesn't work in other diseases, but because the manufacturer could not afford to initially test all of the diseases for statistical significance across a heterogeneous set of patients or the various related diseases that they're studying at the time of FDA approval. Subsequent research by academic institutions and medical experts may lead to the development of clinical recommendations and peer-reviewed medical literature that suggests that the use of the medication is effective in treatment or management for a broader range of rare diseases. Despite new evidence, manufacturers rarely seek a label change once the product is on the market due to the associated costs, and therefore a group of potential patients lack coverage for their indication. The Protect Rare Act would ensure access to FDA-approved treatments supported by peer-reviewed medical literature for rare disease patients. And I humbly ask that my colleagues join me in supporting this common-sense bill that will increase access to life-saving cures and ensure more effective treatment of rare diseases. I'd like to describe one story from my district that puts a finer point on this. A young lady, Tallahassee, who was living with immune thrombocytopenia, repeatedly directed by insurance company to receive IVIG treatments at roughly $175,000 per treatment. She and her doctor identified another infused drug indicated for use in several types of leukemia that's shown results in managing her disease. The drug cost $10,000 per infusion with fewer side effects. Why didn't the manufacturer of the less expensive drug simply go to the FDA and ask for a new label? Because it's cost prohibitive for them. Label indications for patient populations of less than 1,000 when the drug already has a biosimilar on the market are simply not cost effective. That's why we need the flexibility. We need to intelligently approach this, and I urge everybody to support the Protect Rare Act. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes Ms. Custer for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Chairman Guthrie, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us in this hearing that's going a bit long now. This hearing is an opportunity to recognize the impact for rare disease on the lives of millions of Americans across the country, including in my district in New Hampshire. It's also a chance for this committee to address barriers to care, as you've heard from our questions. For many patients with rare diseases, seeing their doctor often requires traveling to a different state and presents a significant barrier to receiving care. I'll tell you a quick story about a child named Georgia, 6-year-old girl from New Hampshire. When she was just a few weeks old, she needed surgery to correct a chronic intestinal pseudo-obstruction. Her local hospital could not perform the surgery, but thankfully, New Hampshire had a long-standing partnership with Boston Children's Hospital. Thanks to that collaboration, she received the care that she needed when she needed it. But other children are not as fortunate. In another state without access to advanced medical care, a 1-year-old with a rare, complex congenital heart disease is racing against the clock to find treatment. Her anatomy is determined to be too complex for surgery close to her home. Boston Children's Hospital is ready to receive her, but first her surgeons must go through hurdles to enroll her in the home state's Medicaid program in order to get the authorization to provide care. Right now, she and her family are still waiting in a children's hospital in her home state, hoping the paperwork goes through in time to transfer her to Boston and save her life. Dr. Bozic, have you had patients and families in your care while they waited to access expertise outside their state or insurance network? And could you describe how that wait impacted their health?
We absolutely have had that in our state. We've had it both ways. Patients who want to come be seen by us, who have unnecessary hurdles thrown up, and vice versa. Although, since I'm the chair of the department, I want to say that all kids in Iowa should come to the University of Iowa, and we certainly welcome them if it's the best place. But in point of fact, I can give you one example where somebody was really very far. It's a pretty big state, and they had a much closer children's hospital and they had very severe kidney disease, and they were left with, they were told that they couldn't go to the other children's hospital, and this patient ended up getting so sick that the family actually had, at a lot of expense to them, had to move closer to our hospital just because now she went from not needing dialysis to needing dialysis multiple times a week. And I asked my faculty, anticipating this hearing, to give me cases. I have 2 pages of such cases, so yeah. It is an absolutely huge problem.
Thank you. Well, because of New Hampshire's unique geographic position, Dartmouth Children's Hospital, in my just often sees patients from neighboring New England states, including Vermont. In your experience, Dr. Bozic, has the process for waiting for another state's Medicaid paperwork to process affected the experience of families whose children are undergoing this treatment?
So absolutely, and we have 50 different Medicaid programs, unfortunately, pretty much. So in the state of Iowa, it takes about 30 days to. So I think it's pretty good. I think it's still too long. But other states require fingerprinting, background checks. We have to send them our social security numbers, and then they might still say no. And it's a 3 or 4 month process, and kids can't wait that long. For some of these diseases, if you have intractable epilepsy and you're awaiting something that we can do at our center, because we have a comprehensive epilepsy program, it means you're having more and more seizures. And we know in epilepsy that the more seizures you have, the more likely you're going to have uncontrolled seizures going forward. So this comes up, unfortunately, all too frequently.
Well, thank you. And I'm proud to support the Accelerating Kids Access to Care Act, legislation that would tremendously help children and their families access specialized out-of-state care. Removing barriers to streamline Medicaid provider enrollment would be a win for rural families, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill. And with that, I yield back with 30 seconds extra.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back, and the chair will recognize Mr. Pence for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Chair Guthrie and Ranking Member Eshoo, and thank you to the witnesses all being here today. We are considering several bills today that would increase innovation and improvement and improve treatment options for patients suffering from rare diseases. According to the National Institute of Health, there are more than 10,000 known rare diseases. However, we only have safe and effective treatment options for a few hundred. I'm proud that pharmaceutical innovators in the Hoosier State, my state, such as Eli Lilly, are leading the charge to develop groundbreaking medicines, but we know developing cures for rare diseases is incredibly challenging. That's why I would like to speak in support of the Orphan Cures Act today, championed by my very good friend, Dr. Joyce. The Orphan Cures Act would make a critical fix to the Inflation Reduction Act's price-setting provisions by incentivizing continuing innovation for rare disease treatments that could yield additional applications. Without a fix, the IRA disincentivizes products from pursuing indications for multiple rare disease populations, which will not only limit the application of drugs coming into the market, but will also discourage investment and development in the next generation for cures. It's important that we do not let red tape and burdensome regulations stifle innovation for the nearly 30 million Americans living with rare diseases. I was personally recently saddened to learn that two of my constituents, Robin and Joel, whose grandfather worked for my family, recently lost their son, Justin, after a courageous fight with a rare form of disease. All children, as you, Ms. Davis, are gifts from God, and we should incentivize research and development that gives them the best chance of leading a successful and healthy life. Dr. Chen, in your oral testimony and then in written, I'm going to quote you here, you say the IRA does not extend this exemption from future price negotiations to drugs with multiple indications, whether they are primarily orphan drugs or not. Consequently, this diminishes the incentives orphan drug manufacturers have for exploring alternative uses for existing drugs and treating other rare diseases. When the chance and cost of failure is so high, how can we better incentivize drug manufacturers like Lilly to take risks or incentivize an innovative treatment, particularly orphan drugs with multiple indications?
No, you can't evaluate the value of a lottery by looking at the winners. In the same way, you can't evaluate the innovation pipeline by looking at only the blockbusters. And in order to incentivize innovation, we need to really consider the cost of failing from phase 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and 3 to approval. And in order to do that, you need to incentivize manufacturers with expected revenues, in particular the rare disease space, where the expected revenues are inherently low due to the smaller market size for patients.
And what do you mean by expected revenues? So taking off any price negotiations, is that?
Well, so expected revenues simply means the life stream of money that a manufacturer anticipates receiving based on the price of the drug and the number of patients they will sell the drug to. The price of the drug should reflect value, as I've said in my statement, and that should be sort of the way we think about expected revenue.
So in a sense, let the free market kind of drive that, not the regulators?
Well, so there needs to be incentives for drug manufacturers to innovate, and after an appropriate level of incentives, there needs to be a market competition to bid down that price of that drug.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Will you yield me?
I will yield the chairman
Thanks.
balance of my time.
I want to say a lot of people have said today that we're saying that you won't have innovation. We haven't said that. We don't say innovation can go to zero, but we know from a CBO score when we did the bill, there will be less innovation because the economic incentives are for less innovation. And so to say that we're saying it's stopping everything isn't, and then point to examples of it moving forward is just not accurate of the argument we're saying. We had members on the other side during the committee hearing when we were marking it up and we brought up the CBO score say, we may get less cures, but we're going to get cheaper prices. And we all want low prices. That's what we want. The question, how do you get low price innovation at the same time? And we're working on lower costs, more transparency throughout the entire healthcare system. We want more affordability because it's necessary. And thank you for yielding to me, and your time has expired, and I will yield back to you, and you yield back. Chair will now recognize Ms. Kelly. Ready? Dr. Schreier, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Guthrie, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. This has been a really interesting discussion. As a pediatrician, I have to say I am so happy that the committee is taking up so many pediatric-focused bills today and that you're all focused on this. Rare diseases, as we heard, impact children the most, and so the treatments do too. Ms. Davis, thank you for sharing your story, and I want to extend my condolences. You also brought up the role of newborn screening in Hunter's disease. And as a pediatrician, one of the first things I wanted to emphasize was the importance of early identification and treatment of so many of these rare diseases. And that one of the most important tools we already have at a very low cost. It's the simple newborn screen, the heel stick that all new babies get in this country. And the common denominator for all 55 of these recommended screenings is that these diseases are rare, but if you detect them early and treat them early, you can give most of these kiddos the gift of a healthy, normal life. And sometimes the interventions are just dietary restrictions, like with PKU or galactosemia. For others, there are medications or gene therapies that we've heard about today, but without early detection, diseases like these, including cystic fibrosis and congenital hypothyroidism, can lead to severe developmental impacts, illness, disability, or death. And that's why I'm so excited about today's discussion. I'd first just like to focus on the Accelerating Kids Access to Care Act. In Washington State, we are proud to have both Seattle Children's and the University of Washington at the forefront of rare disease research and treatment. So patients from Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming travel across state lines to Seattle Children's quite regularly for diagnosis and care for rare diseases that's just not available in their own states. And this presents, as we've heard, a challenge for children on Medicaid. Medicaid state plans require out-of-state providers to be screened and enrolled in their program, even if that provider is already enrolled and in good standing in their own home state. This means that a child from Idaho seeking care in Washington for rare disease may have to wait months for care, delaying care and treatment. And that's why I strongly support the Accelerating Kids Access to Care Act. As I mentioned with newborn screening, early diagnosis and treatment is critical. Dr. Basouk, you mentioned CRMO in your testimony, and I happen to have had a patient with CRMO who was fortunate enough to live within a half hour of Seattle Children's. I was wondering if you could give us a couple more examples of one or two patients, either yours or theoretically, who were or could have been harmed by a prolonged delay in seeing an out-of-state specialist.
Yeah, so we recently just had a case of a child with intractable epilepsy who was on out-of-state Medicaid. As I mentioned, we have a comprehensive epilepsy center, and we have some things that are different. So we have, for example, something called a Transcranial Magnetic Stimulation Center of Excellence run by Aaron Bose, who's our Division Director of Neurology. And this is a very, very powerful magnet that you can use to briefly turn off parts of the brain. And it's used a lot for research purposes, but we use it clinically. And it has FDA approval for some clinical uses, including mapping out what parts of the brain you can safely remove for a child with intractable epilepsy. So we were all ready to do this patient. The patient and our neurosurgeons know how to do these epilepsy surgeries. The patient was ready. The patient just had to sit home and continue to have seizures until we could get approval. I mean,
Which is damaging for their development.
Yeah. And I'm a pediatric neurologist. I see seizures all the time. It's scary for me still.
Yeah,
it's very difficult for families.
I want to move on to just two more quick comments. I just want to submit a statement for the record from the Patients and Providers for Medical Nutrition Equity Coalition in support of HR 6892, the Medical Nutrition Equity Act. And I look forward to working with the chairwoman and ranking member on this. I'd also just like to quickly address an issue raised so many times in today's hearing about Medicare drug price negotiation impacting rare disease research. This is a red herring. There are 10 drugs undergoing price negotiation right now. The likelihood of a pediatric rare disease treatment kids are not covered by Medicare in the first place, being adversely affected by this is highly unlikely. And I have no time left, and I yield back. Thank you.
Dr. Shire yields back, and the chair will recognize Dr. Joyce for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Chairman Guthrie and Ranking Member Eshoo, and to the committee for including two pieces of legislation, H.R. 5539, the Orphan Cures, and H.R. 5547, the Mini Act. In this hearing, these are critical pieces of legislation to the future of patient treatment and to the access to cures in the rare disease space. Both bills, which represent narrow and concise fixes to the IRA to ensure that research and treatments and future innovation that American patients want and American patients deserve are recognized. I want to be clear on what these legislative efforts represent. These are not in any way meant to undermine or alter the fundamental negotiation mechanisms that were passed in the IRA, but rather drive more investment into the rare disease space to develop the next generation of cures and the next generations of therapies in diseases like Merkel cell carcinoma, in diseases like glioblastoma, and give patients and their families hope. The Orphan Drug Act was signed into law the same year that I graduated from medical school, and I have been able to witness firsthand the life-changing and significant innovations in treatments and cures because of that act. The diagnosis of metastatic melanoma that previously carried with it too frequently a referral into hospice care in short order can now be treated, and patients can go on to live. Of note, the first cellular therapy for metastatic melanoma was just announced this month. In fact, since the passage of the Orphan Drug Act, almost 1,200 new medicines have received FDA approval with orphan designation. I hope that everyone on this committee, regardless of party affiliation, wants the level of innovation to continue in treating diseases. I'd also like to add that the passage of the IRA, the orphan provision in Section 1192, is an acknowledgement that orphan disease treatments are meant to be shielded from the negotiation protocol, and that the bills we are considering today is merely an effort to improve that exemption for the patients who ultimately will receive treatment from these future innovations. In a similar vein, the Mini Act narrowly targets therapies utilizing genetically targeted technologies, or GTTs. GTTs were defined for the first time in the 21st Century Cures Act and capture two categories of genetic therapies akin to the biological technologies, small interfering RNA and antisense oligonucleotide. GTTs are still in their infancy, and subjecting these highly complex small molecule drugs to negotiation timelines intended for simpler drugs will disproportionately impact the innovation ways to treat diseases with high unmet medical need. Rare diseases are those defined as affecting fewer than 200,000 Americans, and while rare diseases may individually impact a relatively small number of patients, collectively their impact is far-reaching, affecting 30 million Americans, or roughly 1 in 10. In 2023, research resulted in 71 novel approvals, including new treatments for rare and hard-to-treat conditions. Personally, I am the survivor of a rare pediatric cancer. I lived, and that impact still impacts me every day. Dr. Chen, from an economic perspective, can you speak to the value of post-approval research into additional indications and what that means for patients specifically in the rare disease community?
Absolutely. So the post-approval pipeline of R&D is a much more cost-effective way of doing R&D. You already know what the drug is. It's been approved for one indication. And the ability to test that drug in multiple other rare disease indications is valuable because the incentives to do that might not have been there if you had to develop the drug from the start all the way at the very beginning of this process.
Finally, Ms. Davis, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing the story of the loss of your husband due to glioblastoma. Can you speak to the importance of continued progress of rare conditions for your family and the rare disease community.
I apologize. With 95% of rare conditions lacking an approved treatment, we must continue to drive innovation so patients with unmet needs can access the treatments for their conditions.
To conclude, thank you to all the witnesses, and know that patients can only access and afford orphan medications if they first exist. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.